the power of silence and self-discipline. Most people don't realize, pause, how powerful the simple act of talking can be. Pause. Lean in. All right? The moment you begin to share your goals and your intentions with others, something happens in the brain. It creates a surge of emotion, a burst of energy, almost identical to the feeling you get when you've actually achieved something, And that's the trap. Emphasis. That's the danger. Pause. You feel like you've done the work when in reality, you've done nothing at all. Talking is a counterfeit currency. Pause. Slower. It looks like progress. It feels like progress, but it doesn't buy you anything real. It seduces you into a false sense of accomplishment, a comfortable illusion, that prevents you from doing the very thing that matters most. Pause taking action. Now think about that for a moment. Pause. This illusion is dangerous because it robs you of the hunger that drives achievement. Hunger is uncomfortable. Hunger is restless. Hunger pushes you forward. But when you feed that hunger with premature praise or validation from others, you dull its edge. Emphasis. You trick yourself into believing the battle is already won. And here is the truth. Human beings are wired to seek recognition. The moment you announce your plans, people will give it to you. They'll say, that was a great idea, or we're going to do amazing things. And you'll bask in the glow of that approval. Pause. But all you've really done is cashed in on a reward you haven't earned. And when you take the reward too early, you often lose the will to fight for it later. That's why restraint is so important. Restraint isn't about denying yourself expression for no reason. It's about discipline. Pause. Emphasis. It's less about choosing not to indulge in the counterfeit satisfaction of empty words, so you can save yourself for the genuine satisfaction of accomplishment when you keep your mouth shut about your goals. You keep your hunger intact. You keep the fire burning inside of you instead of letting it fizzle out in front of others. You protect the purity of your ambition. Picture this pause. It's like carrying a heavy bucket of water. Each time you stop to show it off, to tell someone where you're going or what you're doing. You spill a little out. Doesn't seem like much, right? Just a drop here, a drop there. But by the time you arrive at your destination, half the bucket is gone. Oversharing your ambitions works the same way. Every time you leak your plans to someone else, a little energy escapes. Little by little, you drain the very force you need to get where you're going. Silence keeps the bucket full. Pause. Slow down for emphasis. Silence ensures that when you finally arrive, you arrive with something worth showing. And there's another layer. Pause. Right. The moment you tell someone your plans, you open the door to their opinions, their judgments, their doubts. Even if they mean well, even if they care about you, their input can weaken the clarity of your vision. They might say, are you sure that's a good idea? Or that sounds risky. And suddenly you re-second guessing yourself. Silence shields you from that interference. Silence gives your vision time to grow undisturbed, free from outside voices. It is just like a seed. A seed has to stay underground, hidden until it's strong enough to break through the surface. If you expose it too early, it dies before it has the chance to grow. Your goals are the same. They need that quiet space, that period of protection, that season of silence. And the psychology here is simple, but profound. Pause. When you talk, you externalize, you take your vision, your dream, your fire, and you hand it over to the world. And once it's out there, it no longer belongs fully to you. It becomes subject to interpretation, misjudgment, even ridicule. But when you remain silent, you internalize. You keep that vision close, protected, whole. You nurture it privately, building it up until it's strong enough to withstand whatever storms may come. That's why people who practice restraint often appear more focused, more serious, more disciplined. They not scattering their energy in words, they restoring it, refining it, preparing it for use. Silence also creates pressure, a good pressure, the kind that forces action, pause. Okay, when you resist the urge to talk, you don't lose the desire to act. Instead, the desire grows stronger. The pressure builds until it has no outlet except action itself. And that is the kind of pressure that fuels real progress. It keeps you moving because you haven't diffused your ambition through words. You haven't allowed yourself the cheap satisfaction of premature recognition. Instead, you carry that tension within you until the only way to release it is through work, through discipline, through tangible results. And here's the challenge, pause. In today's world, this discipline is harder than ever. We live in a culture of constant oversharing. Social media has trained us to announce every move. We post about starting a new project, launching a new habit, changing our lifestyle, as if visibility itself equals progress. But visibility is not progress. Pause. Emphasis. Visibility is performance. It may win you attention in the short term, but it doesn't build substance in the long term. The people who achieve greatness are the ones who are willing to work without the audience. Slow. They are willing to remain invisible until their results are undeniable. They don't need applause along the way because they're too busy building something worthy of applause at the end. And that's the essence of silence. It is weakness. It is passivity. It's not about saying nothing for the sake of nothing. Silence is strength. Pause. It's the willingness to endure being unseen. It's the discipline to preserve your energy. It's the humility to admit your work is not yet complete. Silence is not passive. Silence is active restraint. Pause, lean in. It is the deliberate choice to protect your ambition from being diluted by talk, to guard it until it matures into something real. Pause, look across audience slowly. Yeah, every word you speak carries energy. Pause, lean in. And the problem is, most people don't even realize how much energy they're giving away with their words. Think about it. You wake up with a certain amount of fuel in the tank, a fixed amount of mental, emotional, and physical energy you can spend during the day. Pause. And what you do with that fuel determines how far you go. But here's the catch. Pause. Every time you talk about your goals, every time you announce your plans, you're spending fuel. You're burning energy that should have been saved for action. Now at first glance, that doesn't sound so bad, right? You talk a little, you explain yourself, you share your intentions, but here's the truth. Small leaks drain big reservoirs. Imagine a car with a tiny hole in the gas tank. You don't notice it at first. Just a drop here, a drop there. But drive long enough with that leak, and you will run out of fuel miles before your destination. Talking too much works the same way. Every word is a drop, and sooner or later, the tank is empty, And here's what makes it worse, pause. Most of the energy we lose doesn't even go toward anything useful. It gets wasted on appearances, on explanations, on defending ourselves to people who have no stake in our success. We burn up mental fuel trying to justify our plans. We burn emotional fuel seeking validation. We burn physical fuel staying up late, rehearsing conversations that don't need to happen in the first place. It's exhaustion by leakage. Emphasis. Not exhaustion from building, not exhaustion from striving, but exhaustion from talking. And the tragedy is when the moment finally comes to do the work, the energy is gone. You're too tired to build because you have already spent yourself talking about building. Pause, slower delivery. Have you ever noticed how excited people get when they tell others about a new idea? Their eyes light up, their hands move, their voice rises. It feels electric, but watch what happens the next day. The excitement is gone. The energy is gone. The fire is gone. Why? Because they released it in conversation instead of channeling it into action. This is the psychological trap. Talking mimics the emotional payoff of progress, but it strips you of the actual drive to progress. You leave the conversation feeling like you've done something, but in reality, you've only drained yourself. It's like cashing a paycheck before you've even earned it. It feels good for a moment, but when the time comes to collect, the account is empty. Pars. Now this isn't about becoming cold or antisocial. It's not about cutting yourself off from people. It's about recognizing that energy is finite, and the higher your goals, the more fiercely you must protect it. High achievers don't waste fuel. They don't squander energy explaining themselves to people who don't matter. They don't burn hours talking about what they were going to do. They direct their energy into doing it. And this is where discipline becomes essential. Pause, emphasis. Discipline means recognizing the leak before it drains you. It means catching yourself when you're tempted to explain your next move to someone who hasn't earned the right to hear it. Ask yourself this. Every time I talk about my plans, am I building energy or bleeding it? Am I fueling my drive or am I draining it? Most of the time, if you're honest, you'll see it's a drain. It's an energy leak, and the cost of that leak isn't just fatigue. The cost is momentum. Momentum is precious. Momentum is what carries you through the hard days, the slow days, the days when motivation is nowhere to be found. But momentum can build if you constantly releasing energy in the wrong direction. Every time you talk, you break the rhythm, you interrupt the flow, you reset the pressure that should have been pushing you forward. Pause, lower voice slightly. That is why the people who achieve extraordinary results often appear quiet, even mysterious. They aren't wasting energy. They're restoring it. They're regarding it. They're letting it build pressure inside until it explodes in action. And when it does, the world can ignore it. Because it is not just words anymore. It is real. It's undeniable. You think of it like a dam. A dam holds back water, building pressure behind it. If you poke holes in the wall, the water leaks out. It loses its power. But if you keep it contained, that same water can generate enough force to power entire cities. Your energy works the same way. Leak it through careless words, and it evaporates into nothing. Hold it, guard it, channel it, and it becomes unstoppable power. Pause, look across audience. Now, here is a question for you. How many of your goals have failed? Not because you didn't have the ability, not because you didn't have the opportunity, but because you talked them to death before they even had a chance to live. That's a hard truth to face, but it's liberating. Liberating because once you see it, once you recognize that silence preserves your energy, you can change everything. You can start fueling your goals instead of draining them. You can learn to channel your excitement into building instead of broadcasting. And let me tell you something. Lean in, slower. There is nothing more powerful than a person who refuses to leak their energy. Because when the day comes for them to reveal their work, it speaks louder than any words ever could. You pause. Let silence hang for a beat. Your vision is fragile in its early stages. Pause. And that's the part most people don't understand. When you first get an idea, when you first set a goal, it feels powerful. It feels like nothing can stop you. But in reality, it's as delicate as a flame in the wind. One wrong breath, one careless word, and it can be blown out. And what do we usually do with that delicate flame? We expose it. We run around telling everyone about it. Friends, family, coworkers. We hand them our vision like it's indestructible. But here's the truth. Not everyone who hears your vision will protect it. Pause, lean in. In fact, most 1T. Some will doubt you. Some will laugh. Some will poke holes in your idea just to feel smarter than you. And some, this is the harshest truth, will quietly resent you for daring to aim higher than they ever did. And every one of those responses is like water on your flame gesture. Slowly, drip by drip, they weaken it until eventually the fire that once felt unstoppable begins to flicker. You start to wonder, maybe they rewrite. Maybe I can T. Maybe this was too big for me. Do you see the danger? You gave your vision away before it had roots. You handed it over to people who weren't responsible for protecting it. And in doing so, you let their voices drown out your own. Pause. Slower delivery. Your vision is yours. It was a T given to them. It was given to you. They weren't T there when the seed was planted. They didn't feel that spark of inspiration in your chest. They don't carry the same responsibility to bring it to life, So why do we let them decide its worth? Here's the simple truth. The earlier the stage of your vision, the more silence it requires. Emphasis, because silence protects. Silence gives your idea time to grow strong enough to withstand the winds of doubt. Think about it like this. Pause. A farmer doesn't dig up seeds every day to show the neighbors. He plants them in the soil, waters them, nurtures them, and lets them develop in secret. Why? Because the seed can't survive constant exposure. Your vision is the same. If you expose it too early, it gets crushed under the weight of opinions. But if you keep it covered, if you protect it in silence, it develops roots. And once it has roots, once it's strong, nothing can rip it out of the ground. Pause, walk slowly across stage, but let's be honest, guarding your vision isn't easy because we crave validation. We want others to cheer us on. We want to hear, that's a great idea. You're going to succeed. But here's the harsh reality. Most people aren't capable of giving you the encouragement you were hoping for. Not because they were evil, not because they want to see you fail, but because they can only see the world through their own limitations. They can't see your vision because it was a T given to them. And if you rely on them for permission, you'll never start. That's why silence is so powerful. Pause, softer voice. Silence keeps you independent. Silence allows you to build without interference. Silence gives you the space to strengthen your belief without being infected by someone else's doubt. Your pause, lean toward audience. Now some of you might be thinking, but what about mentors? What about trusted people in my life? And you're right, there's a difference. Wise counsel is not the same as casual conversation. A mentor, someone who has walked the road before you, can help shape your vision without destroying it. But notice the difference. You choose them carefully. You don't hand your vision to just anyone. The mistake is believing that everyone deserves to know your next move. They don't talk. And not everyone has earned the right to hold your vision. And this is where discipline comes in again. Pause. Discipline means resisting the urge to announce everything. It means saying, this dream is mine. I'll guard it. I'll protect it. I'll let it grow until it's too strong to be shaken. Think about history. Every great innovator, every great builder, every great leader, at some point, they had to protect their vision from outside influence. Imagine if the Wright brothers had told everyone in their town, we're going to build a machine that flies. They would have been laughed at, ridiculed, maybe even stopped. But because they kept building in silence, the day came when they didn't have to talk about flying. They showed the world, and in that moment, all the doubters were silenced. Pause, raise voice slightly. That's the goal. To get to the point where your results speak louder than any explanation ever could. But to get there, you must first endure the season of silence. So ask yourself, who have you been giving your vision to? Who have you been allowing to shape your dreams? You know? And more importantly, what would happen if you stopped? What would happen if, starting today, you decided to guard your vision like it was sacred? Because it is. It's sacred, it's yours, and if you don't protect it, no one else will. Pause, let silence linger. When you zip your mouth, when you guard your vision, you give it a chance to survive. And not just survive, thrive, grow, expand, until it is no longer fragile, until it is unshakable, until the very people who once doubted you can't ignore what you've built. That is the power of silence, pause, softer voice. It doesn't just protect your energy. It doesn't just keep you from wasting fuel. It shields your vision from the destructive weight of other people's less opinions. And once you learn to guard your vision, once you learn to keep it safe, you'll discover something remarkable. You don't need their permission. You don't need their applause. You don't need their validation, because the fire inside you will be strong enough to stand on its own. Long pause, let the weight sink in. There's a point in every journey where silence is no longer about protection. It is about power. Pause, because eventually your results become louder than any words you could have spoken. And let us be honest, words are cheap. Pause, lean in. You know this. Talk is easy. Anyone can say, I am going to start a business. I am going to get in shape. I am going to change my life. But talk by itself, doesn't T move the needle? It does T build the company. It does T shed the weight. It doesn't T change the habits. Action does, discipline does, persistence does. And here's the truth. Most people don't like to hear when you talk too much about what you're going to do. You trick yourself into thinking you've already done something. You get that little dopamine hit of approval. Someone pats you on the back and says, wow, that's amazing. And suddenly you feel satisfied without lifting a finger. Pause, slower delivery. Oh, but satisfaction without results is poison. It kills your hunger. It steals the fire you need to actually build. That's why silence is so powerful. Because silence keeps you hungry. Emphasis, it keeps the pressure inside. It forces you to act instead of announce, And here's the beautiful irony. When you stop telling people what you're going to do, you free yourself to actually do it. And when you actually do it, when the results finally show up, you don't need to explain anything. The results speak for themselves. Pause, raise hand slightly as if weighing words. Think about it. Who commands more respect? The person who says, I'm going to start working out, or the one who shows up a year later, lean, strong, transformed? Who commands more respect? The person who says, I'm going to be successful one day, or the one who quietly builds until their success is undeniable? The answer is obvious, because results don't just prove your point. They silence every doubter in the room. Pause. Let the silence linger. But let me warn you, this requires patience. It requires you to be comfortable in the shadows for a while, to work when no one is watching, to grind without applause, to build without recognition. And that is hard, because we live in a world addicted to immediate validation, a world where people post their goals online just to hear congratulations before they've even started. But let me ask you, what is better? Temporary applause for an unproven dream, or permanent respect for undeniable results? You pause, lean forward. If you choose the second, you've got to learn to zip your mouth. You've got to be willing to delay recognition. You've got to be willing to let the work pile up quietly so that when you finally emerge, the results can't be ignored. Now, let me give you a picture gesture slowly. Imagine a tree growing underground. For years, no one sees it. Roots are spreading, deepening, anchoring. From the outside, it looks like nothing is happening. People might even laugh. Where's your tree? You've been watering dirt for years, but one day, suddenly, without warning, It breaks through the surface, and when it does, it doesn't stop. It shoots upward, strong, unshakable, because it spent years developing what no one could see. That's what silence does for you. It gives you time to grow your roots, and once your results break the surface, no opinion, no criticism, no doubt can stop you. Pause, softer voice. Now, here's just where the real power lies. When you let results speak for themselves, you gain something words could never buy: credibility. See, you can talk your way into attention, but you can talk your way into respect. Respect comes only from proof. Respect comes when people look at your life and say, I can argue with that. The results are right there, and let's take it deeper. Pause. Results don't just silence doubters. They inspire believers. When someone sees what you've built, they don't just say, you did it. They say, maybe I can do it too. That is the difference between noise and legacy. Noise fades, legacy multiplies. And legacy isn't built by talking. It's built by doing. Pause, let it settle. So let me challenge you. Stop broadcasting every move. Stop telling the world what you are about to do. Instead, put your head down, do the work, and let the work speak for you. Because here's the truth. The world does need more promises. It needs proof. Pause, slower delivery, and the most powerful proof you can ever give is your own transformation. When the results show up, people will notice. You, one, have to beg for their attention. You, one, have to argue with them. You, one, have to defend yourself. You'll simply stand there quietly with results that speak louder than any speech you could give. You paused, softer voice for impact, and in that moment, you'll realize the silence was worth it. Every unspoken word, every withheld announcement, every quiet night of work when no one believed in you, because the results will be undeniable. And the best part, results don't just prove you were right. They prove you were disciplined. They prove you were consistent. They prove you were willing to hold the line when most people cave to the temptation of talking. That proof is priceless. So remember this: when you zip your mouth, when you hold back the urge to announce, when you keep your vision protected and let your work mature in silence, you earn something words can never buy. You earn the right to let your results do the talking. Pause, let it breathe. Then slowly nod as if sealing the point. There's a kind of freedom that most people never experience. Pause. And it's not the freedom of money or the freedom of time or even the freedom of success. Those are powerful, yes. But there's a deeper freedom. It's the freedom of silence. Now that may sound strange at first, but think about it. Most people are prisoners to opinions, prisoners to validation, prisoners to the need for recognition. They feel they have to tell people what they're redoing. They feel they have to explain their goals, defend their dreams, justify their actions. But when you learn to zip your mouth, when you learn to walk quietly, to move without broadcasting, to keep your vision sacred, you step into a kind of freedom that very few ever know. Paused, slower tone, because suddenly you are no longer living for their approval. You no longer controlled by their doubt. You no longer swayed by their judgment. You free. Free to build at your own pace, free to make mistakes in private without ridicule, free to grow roots underground without someone telling you that's taking too long. And that freedom is priceless. Pause, lean in slightly. See, most people waste so much energy on what others think. They post their dreams online, not because they want accountability, but because they re-addicted to applause. They share their every move, not because it helps them, but because it gives them a momentary high. But here is the problem. When you depend on that high, you become a slave to it. You become chained to the opinions of others. And if they clap, you feel good. If they don't T-clap, you feel worthless. That's not freedom. That's bondage. True freedom comes when you no longer need the applause, when you no longer need to explain yourself, when you no longer need to defend what you're redoing. Pause, softer voice. When you can simply do the work quietly, consistently, faithfully, and let the results speak when they re-ready. And let me tell you, that's a liberating way to live because it removes the pressure to impress. It removes the noise of doubt. It removes the need to live up to anyone's expectations except your own. Now I know what some of you might be thinking, but Jim, is it lonely to stay silent? Doesn't it feel isolating to keep things to yourself? You pause, look out at audience, and the answer is, it depends. It depends on whether you're relooking at silence as emptiness or as strength. Because silence, when chosen intentionally, isn't a loneliness. It's as focus. It's as clarity. It as power. In fact, the people who accomplish the most in life, they've all learned how to use silence as a weapon. They know that if you protect your vision from noise, you give it the space to grow. Pause, hand gesture. And here's the irony. When you embrace silence, you actually build deeper connections with people. Because instead of filling the air with talk, you let your character show. Instead of trying to convince people of your worth, you let your actions demonstrate it. And that draws people to you, not because of your promises, but because of your presence. Pause. Slower for gravity. Silence gives you freedom from explanation, freedom from judgment, freedom from premature criticism. But it also gives you something else, something most people overlook. It gives you freedom from yourself. What do I mean by that? Well, when you talk too much about your goals, you create unnecessary pressure. You start to measure yourself by your words instead of your work. You create a false version of yourself that you now have to live up to, But when you stay silent, you don't have to live up to anything except your effort. Today, you not performing for an audience, you re-performing for progress, and that is the truest form of freedom there is, pause, softer tone, then build gradually. Let me give you one last picture. Imagine you re-carrying a seed. That seed is your dream, your vision, your goal. If you keep pulling it out of the ground to show everyone, look, I am growing something, the seed dies. Never takes root, but if you protect it, if you water it quietly, if you shield it from the elements of doubt and criticism, one day it grows into a tree that gives shade, fruit, and strength to everyone around you. That's freedom, the freedom of knowing you don't have to prove anything today. You don't have to show the seed. You don't have to justify the dirt. You just have to do the work and let time reveal what you've been building. Pause, lean forward, steady voice, and when that day comes, when the tree stands tall, when the results are visible, when your work speaks louder than your words, you'll feel something no applause could ever give you. You'll feel peace, because you'll know you did it. Not for validation, not for recognition, not for praise, but for the growth itself, for the discipline, for the freedom of becoming who you were meant to be. That's what silence gives you. That's what zipping your mouth earns you. Not just results, not just respect, not just credibility, but freedom. True, unshakable, undeniable freedom. Pause, softer, almost a whisper. Right? And once you taste that, you'll never go back.